I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Kayla Willette. She's with ADAPT. It's ADAPT Community Supported Ecology. And what I'd like to do is just read 2 paragraphs of what they have in their mission. Why community supported ecology? We believe that each of us and each plot of land is vital to a healthy future. ADAPT exists to sustain and promote the connections between people and the land that supports us through community co-creation of native plant and perennial food landscapes. Through crowdfunding, education, and volunteer effort, we aim to build a community network that supports the restoration of native plant and perennial food landscapes on small parcels of privately and publicly owned land where there might otherwise not be the resources to do so. Kayla is the Kalamazoo Garden Coordinator for that organization. So Kayla, if you would, we're available now for you to speak.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the introduction and for sharing some information about ADAPT as well. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. So thank you so much to Nikki for inviting me to come speak. And thanks for everyone here today for coming. So I wanted to just maybe talk a little bit about native plants and climate resiliency. As Nikki mentioned, I volunteer with ADAPT Community Supported Ecology. And this is kind of our primary goal. We believe wholeheartedly in like these grassroots efforts and making small changes, which can hopefully better the environment. So just a little bit about myself. I got my master's degree from Western Michigan University in 2020 in the Comparative Religious Studies department, where I did a lot of research on sacred geography and things like that, which kind of spurred my interest in landscapes and in particular kind of historical landscapes and those really kind of intact ecosystems. I also teach yoga at the university, certified yoga instructor, and I started volunteering with ADAPT about a year ago, and we just had our first planting season in Kalamazoo. So ADAPT originated in Ann Arbor area, and I believe about 2019, and they've since spread kind of slowly through Michigan into the greater surrounding Detroit area, but also into East Lansing, Grand Rapids, Benton Harbor, and now Kalamazoo. So we're really excited to be starting this in Kalamazoo. I've lived here for about 10 years or so, and right away, I was really drawn to the culture of Kalamazoo. We already have a lot of native plant initiatives in place. A lot of organizations already doing a lot of this and spreading a lot of awareness and information. So I thought it'd be a really good area, a really good city to start doing some of this work. So just a quick rundown of the agenda of what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to start with kind of the problem with the traditional American landscaping model. And because this is about climate change, of course, I'm going to be drawing that back into, in particular, I'm going to focus on freshwater. So the issues with American landscaping model and its impacts and how it's kind of exacerbating the issues with freshwater in the face of a changing climate. And then we're going to kind of move forward and think about reimagining landscapes and how we can still maintain beautiful lawns and gardens, but keeping the climate in mind and biodiversity in mind and things like that. And we're going to talk a little bit about maybe starting your own garden and things like that. Just as a quick question, how many of you have already started, like maybe you already landscape with native plants or you looked into it or you're gardening with it already? Just as a quick, awesome. That's fantastic. So Marty, kind of talking to people that already know what we're doing here. So that's great. So starting with kind of some of the issues with the existing American landscape model, of course, what comes to mind are these really pristine green grass lawns. And one of the issues, one of the primary issues with that is kind of pollution, not directly related to pollution, but if you think about things like air pollution coming from gas lawnmowers and all of the exhaust that comes from consistent maintenance of the turf grass that we use. Also, this was surprising to me. Oil spills from refilling gas lawnmowers is actually substantial. And I didn't realize that. But then also runoff from herbicide, pesticide use, because not only turf grass, but the ornamental plants that we tend to use are not ideally suited for our environment. We're more often having to apply pesticides, herbicides in order to maintain those. So all kind of pollutive agents that we can try to get away from, and as we're planting more natives. The other primary issue is that the majority of our landscaping species right now are non-native. It's estimated in the horticulture industry right now that up to 80% of the plants that we use are non-native. And so the issues with non-native, as I mentioned, they're not ideally suited for our climate. So they require constant modification of the environment. Excessive water use is one example. We're having to water them frequently. Another aspect is that non-native species are 40 times more likely to become invasive than native species, which means they're out competing our native plants. As they're spreading, our animals spread them into different areas where we didn't anticipate that they would be. And then we're reducing biodiversity of our plants and the animals that those plants support in turn as well. And also, of course, water usage, using excessive amounts of water. So just a few turf grass problems in numbers here. 30 to 40 millions of acres of lawn are estimated to be in the United States. And I did the math. This is about 2% of the continental US. 10 number of times more pesticide use per acre than commercial farms, which is fascinating and awful. 5% of air pollution in the US is caused by lawnmowers, which is also surprising. 17 millions of gallons of fuel spilled during refilling of lawn and garden equipment, which is actually more than the Exxon Valdez oil spill, I came to find out. 9 billions of gallons of water per day used in residential landscaping only. And then 30 to 60% of urban fresh water used is used for lawns. So that's 1/3 to 2/3 of our freshwater usage. And so we come to the climate change risks to freshwater. So shifting away from plants for a moment and just looking at the water issues that climate change is imposing upon us. So we start with less water for drinking. So the water that we have available is diminishing. And in the face of that, the water that is required to drink, we're having an increased demand for drinking water. So number one, no, not enough water to drink. That's fun. Number two, less water for agriculture. So as the water is diminishing, we have less water to grow food and crops. And in the Midwest in particular, we grow a lot of specialty crops. So apples, cherries, pumpkins, things like that are very sensitive to drought. And so we're pumping a lot of groundwater to supplement, which is causing groundwater depletion. It's estimated that about 70% of all groundwater withdrawals are for agriculture specifically. And of course, that will most likely only increase as the water situation gets worse. Similarly, more infrastructure failures. So with climate change is showing an increase in frequent high intensity storms, rainstorms, and it's more likely to cause dam failures, for example. And we witnessed that kind of firsthand in 2020 with the Edenville Dam flood near Midland. I don't know if any of you remember that. And there was a state-appointed independent forensic team that looked into that infrastructure failure to try to identify what the cause of the failure was. And they determined that it was this phenomenon called static liquefaction, which is where the soil becomes so saturated with water that it loses all of its strength and thus compromises the integrity of the structure itself, which caused the dam to collapse. And they've surveyed, and I don't know exactly what year they did this, but they surveyed dams in the US, and it's estimated there are about 15,000 dams that are at risk for similar failures. Hopefully they're able to reinforce some of these, but it's just one of the many issues caused by these increased storms. And lastly, increased runoff, agricultural runoff primarily, and harmful algal blooms. So the example that I found was Lake Erie during the summer. Due to the increased agricultural runoff and warmer temperatures, these algae bloom across the surface of the water, and it actually kind of suffocates the lower layers of the lake. So no oxygen, no sunlight are getting down, causing these dead zones, which aren't allowing any life to thrive. So reducing biodiversity and causing this long-term stress for lake life. So these are just a few of the risks of freshwater in the face of climate change. And if we're thinking about native plants and how, we were estimating about 9 billion gallons of water used per day for residential landscaping. Once native plants are established, they require almost little to no additional water beyond rainfall, which in an ideal world, that 9 billion gallons becomes almost zero. Of course, then we're talking about fractions of that if only some people are converting, which is still a little bit, goes a long way. So, so part two, we talked about this kind of scary climate crisis thing, no water for drinking, no water for eating, like growing food to eat. And I think that, oh, sorry, there's, I think that when we talk about climate crises like this, it can become very daunting for people. There's a lot of kind of climate trauma, especially in these younger generations, Gen Z, and like my children who are Gen Alpha. And it can be very difficult to figure out what to do about it because it seems so overwhelming. It's such a huge worldwide global problem. And so for me, I kind of found native landscaping as this is something really tangible that I could do where I could start seeing immediate impacts on my environment. So some alternatives to traditional landscaping. Purdue University identified kind of this theory to these different approaches in alternatives to native lands or to traditional landscaping, evolutionary and revolutionary. So evolutionary are these small, more modest changes that we can make. For example, I switched to using an electric lawnmower about 3 or 4 years ago. So these are these little things that we can do, look into more efficient watering methods, or maybe applying fertilizer and pesticides at more appropriate times when the wind isn't blowing, for example, or it's not raining very hard. But then we also have these revolutionary approaches, which are large scale. So we're changing the type of grass we're using, which currently, there are like 4 or 6 types of lawn grass that we most commonly use in the United States, none of which are native. And so thinking about changing to a native type of grass or interplanting your grass with something like clover, which is very low lying. It's not going to get real tall. It's not going to spread or go crazy. And then, of course, we're going to be talking today more about native landscaping or xeriscaping. Xeriscaping is adapting your lawn to require no additional watering. And that's commonly talked about in the Southwest. So this picture here down on the left, you can see all the cacti and things. And it's such a radical alternative to traditional horticulture. Landscaping in your backyard requires no additional watering. So what is native landscaping? Native landscaping is essentially just landscaping with native plants. A very tricky term. Essentially, native plants are those found naturally in our Michigan landscapes. They can help improve water quality. They're attractive alternatives. They often typically almost always have much deeper roots, which serve a whole lot of really beneficial purposes, like absorbing runoff, breaking down pollutants that would otherwise go straight into storm drains, rivers. And they overall just encourage a more healthy yard and require much less maintenance. So that's what Adapt tries to do, is we try to put in gardens that are filled with native plants and grasses. And Nikki gratefully already read our mission statement, so I won't repeat that. And here's just a little bit of information about kind of the scale of the organization as it was 2 years ago. So they haven't updated their website since 2021. So that it's only grown since then. But just a rough idea, over 3,000 species of wildflowers, grasses, trees, and shrubs have been planted. And Adapt has a few different services that we provide, and they're all free of charge because we're a nonprofit organization. And the primary one, the most common one, is garden installations. So people can sign up to receive a garden kit. And for example, myself and other volunteers will actually come to the person's home and help them identify where they want the garden to go. We'll help you prepare the space. So maybe you're refurbishing an existing lawn, or maybe an existing garden bed, excuse me, that currently has non-natives or only some natives. So we can kind of transition into a more native garden. Or maybe you just have lawn and we'll help you rip up the sod and install your garden. So that's the first service. A second is just a garden kit. So we just deliver a bunch of native plants to your house. This is typically for people that are more experienced with gardening in general, maybe have some experience with native plants, and they don't really need the help or the installation or anything, the advice, and they just want the plants, and that's fantastic. We do that as well. Another one that we do is public information, so like this session today. And then lastly, we also, and this is more on the east side of the state currently. I'm hoping to expand this more in Kalamazoo, but is giving homeowners and maybe small business owners like a garden information. So we'd come out and survey your site and give you advice on where you can maybe replace non-natives with natives, or where a garden might go, or what your existing plants are. Maybe you don't know what kind of trees or shrubs or flowers you currently have. And so we can come out and kind of talk through those things. So that's kind of what Adapt does. And I love this infographic. We're talking about how native plants and their root systems in particular can be really beneficial for the environment. So not only are the plants above ground helping with biodiversity and things like that, but we're also below ground doing a lot of work as well. They're absorbing the pollutants, and you can just see all of these gorgeous root structures. And then way over here on the left, we have the lawn grass, which is just, it looks so sad next to all of the other ones. And you can just see the difference in surface area of the roots of the lawn grass versus these native plants. And so they're so much better equipped for soil stability, so helping prevent soil erosion, and just a lot more surface area for absorbing those pollutants, filtering the groundwater, so our groundwater is actually purified and it's cleaner. And so aside from simply the reduction in water usage, which is kind of what we were focusing on in the face of climate change, there are additional benefits of native plants as well in the face of climate change. So we're all kind of aware of this situation where biodiversity is in decline. And so one of the benefits of native plants is that it supports biodiversity and native biodiversity. Plants essentially form the foundation of the habitat for insects, birds, animals. And through thousands of years of coevolution, it's really only native plants that are ideally adapted and suited to sustain the abundance and diversity of the animals that we need to run our ecosystem. So it's so pivotal that we're planting these diverse native plant species. they also, the increase in area of native landscapes is that it increases the mobility of the animals who need to move to find more nesting and food opportunities, habitat opportunities, maybe evading predators and things like that. And so the more we can build these wildlife corridors where, you know, my neighbor's yard, the next person's yard, there's actually like this mobility that's created for these animals. And secondly, carbon sequestration. I found a couple of little tidbits of information that an intact grassland can sequester 2 to 5 tons of carbon per year on every acre. And so if we're going back to that 30 to 40 million acres of lawn currently in the United States, that's actually, 60 to 200 million acres, tons of carbon per year that could potentially be sequestered. Currently, native plants only represent about 5% of Earth's biomass, that account for 20 to 30% carbon fixation. So they have these huge potential benefits for sequestering carbon. We know that like native forests, for example, are kind of the champions of carbon sequestration. We all think of trees, planting trees, but it's not just trees, it's the plants as well, the shrub layer and the ground layer as well, that are also working to enhance soil health and sequester that carbon into the soil. Okay, so where do we start? We have all this great information. We know how beneficial that it can be. We know that there's this huge need in the face of a changing climate to do some of this work. So where do I start? And this is where I found myself back in 2017 when I bought my first house here in Kalamazoo. And I finally had a lawn where I'm like, okay, I'm so excited. I finally get to plant my own native plants. But I don't have a background in horticulture or botany, and I didn't really know what I was doing. So where I started was just, we had those little free libraries in my neighborhood. And I found this book about gardening with perennial plants. I knew I wanted to use perennial plants. Perennials are those that come back every year. Annuals only stick around for 1 year. So I had this book of perennial plants. Unfortunately, it wasn't a book specifically about native plants. It's probably published in the 1980s or something. Luckily, they had little icons indicating the native plants. So I was literally going through and highlighting all of the native plants and reading everything I could about it. I'm one of those people that needs the book, like the physical thing to look at. And then I found out that Pierce Cedar Creek Institute was having a native plant sale. So I was comparing their plant list to my plant book, and nothing was really matching up. So I started Googling all of the plants from Pierce Cedar Creek Institute's plant list. And that's how I started learning about the different plants that were available and putting in my first garden. What I would honestly recommend, instead of doing the way I did, is I would use this Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And I'm gonna try to share this. Because it's super fascinating. Can you guys see that page? Okay, they have this really, really cool resource. If you go to the resource page or the resource drop down, they have a vegetation circa 1800 map. So we're gonna go down to the map viewer. And wait for it to load. And this really cool kind of color scheme. And you can actually put in your address. And I'm going to put in Western's address because I know it by heart now. Then we can kind of zoom. I'm gonna move this slider out of the way for a moment just to get our bearings. So you can see like Stadium Drive here, main campus over here. We've got East Campus. Zoom out just a little bit more. So there's our downtown. We're focusing on Western here. So then I'm going to move my slider over and we can see all these really cool coded color patterns. And we notice that main campus is primarily kind of this light yellow color, but we've also got like some other colors in here. So we're going to go up to the legend, and this is going to show us what we're looking at. One of my critiques for this website is that some of these colors look way too similar, and I can't tell, like, is this grassland or is this oak pine barrens? You know, so like you have to kind of do some digging to figure out what you're looking at. But we do know that this light yellow here is mixed oak savanna. So, you know, if we're planting on main campus, I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to look at mixed oak savanna list. So once we find out what we're looking at and what community we want, plant community, we're going to go into this natural communities drop down and go to communities by name and group. And this will show you all of those kind of plant communities that were on the map page. Some of them are named a little bit differently. It's kind of gotta, we're gonna go to oak openings, which is our oak savanna. And it gives you this really, really nice overview of what the savanna is, landscape context, soil type, natural processes that occur in the savanna, types of vegetation and how they're structured, and then our plant list. So this is where I would recommend getting your plant list from, is figuring out your specific plot and going from there. And so we've got our different types of grasses and sedges, different kinds of wildflowers, and then ferns, vines, shrubs, trees. Like it goes through all of that good stuff. So I'm gonna switch back to my presentation here. I just wanted to show you that because it's such a neat way to get a plant list that's very specific to where your house is. And so when you're Googling plants and you're reading about them, things to note are just what kind of sun exposure do they need? You know, if I have a south-facing plot that has no trees, I'm going to want sun-loving plants. Soil type, maybe this, you know, the structure of the plant. So size, shape, color, what time of year it blooms, and those kinds of things when you're kind of designing your garden, your space. So identifying where you want your garden to go, that's going to help with your plant, you know, what plants you decide to plant based on sun exposure, soil type, and then also choosing your species and designing. For designing, I highly recommend this Planting in a Post-Wild World book by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. Designing is still an area where I still have a lot of opportunity to grow. So I'm very interested in garden design. And then of course, if needed, develop a timeline. That was one of the things that was quite daunting to me in the beginning, because you have to buy your plants at a certain time and then you have to get them in the ground within a week after that. So is your space ready? Do you need to remove sod? Things like that. So just some quick kind of basic elements of garden design when you're designing your own garden. I would highly recommend just starting small with 3 to 5 species if you have no experience. Sounds like a lot of you already do some of this, which is very, very cool. But if you're starting small, 3 to 5 species, maybe 1 grass species, and then a few wildflowers. You want to try to design with symmetry and balance in mind. So as you can see, this kind of schematic in the upper right here, like the black-eyed Susans, or what looks like black-eyed Susans, are kind of mirroring them in the other corner, the orange is mirroring the orange. And so there's a lot of nice symmetry and balance in here. And then we're also trying to kind of mimic the feel of a natural landscape. So we're not planting like one species, one plant of one species here, and then one way over here. We're planting like 5 to 6 in one space. And then we're planting 5 to 6 of the same species in another space. So planting in these groups and these patches. And then we're also organic shapes. So these, I love this picture here of the gardens in BC, because it's a really good example of these kind of curving lines. In nature, we don't have like these straight rows of trees typically, or straight rows of like trilliums down the forest path. You know, it's these kind of organic lines. And actually, curved pathways, supposedly in an aesthetic sense, are supposed to give a lot of intrigue and interest to landscape design. And then we also, and this is kind of going in the face of starting small, but we want to maybe think ahead about the 3 layers. So it's not just the ground layers, not just the beautiful flowers that we tend to think about when we think about gardens. It's also that shrub layer, it's the tree layer. So this picture on the bottom right, and even the Victoria Gardens, there are really good examples of like thinking in these layers because they all interact in terms of supporting diverse wildlife. Trees are more commonly hosts to lots of caterpillars and things, and they provide shelter for birds and things like that. So maybe if we're starting small, we're not thinking the 3 layers just yet, but something to keep in mind as we're designing. And so these are just a couple of sample garden designs that were put together by Adapt. And you can see they've got these really nice kind of flowing shapes, these rounded edges, the symmetry and the kind of like the green raindrops on the left here and the orange, the butterfly milkweed and the purple echinacea in the middle. So they have these real nice balance and symmetry, planting in patches. So there's multiple plants in each area of the same species. So just a couple examples. And then if you don't want to do all that stuff, like that stuff is fascinating and it's super fun for people that are really into that. But if you don't want to think about that, you're like, I just want native plants in my yard and I don't want to think about all that stuff. You can just reach out to us. We have a service request form and we can do all of that stuff for you. And we can put the plants in and you can just enjoy them instead of doing all that prep work. And then there's other ways to get involved too, besides just creating a garden. There's lots of informational events with Kalamazoo area wild ones and plant swaps, stewardship work days with Pure Cedar Creek and Swimlick, the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. There's also recently started a native plant landscape service, which is really exciting. It's called Drop Seed Landscaping. So they're going to be doing larger scale projects. They want adapt as those 5-foot by 10-foot plots roughly, but drop seed landscaping can do much bigger areas. And there's also free native plant seeds at the Portage District Library Seed Library, which is really cool. I believe it started by a Wild Ones member. And you can also buy native plants at Hidden Savannah Nursery, which is local and nearby. So they're a great resource as well. So lots of ways to get involved. And this is just a recommended list of reading and resources. Some are more philosophical and more about the climate focus, like Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy. But then there's also very instructional things about how to start a garden, like the USDA, the Wild Ones Handbook, things like that. So lots of really cool resources here, and additional sources. And that's all I've got. So any questions or comments?
So I'll start with Rick because you're the first hand I see raised.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, Kayla, great informative presentation. That was just great. You realize that you're kind of a carbon copy of Wild Ones and of their existence. What's do you have a relationship with them? Do you collaborate with them, or just how does that work?
Yeah, so I started reaching out to, I think her name is Quinn Edwards, with Kalamazoo area Wild Ones, and she also works. That's how I found out about the seed library that she started at Portage District Library, and she and I have talked a lot about collaboration. She was really excited that I was starting to do this work because she felt like they provide a lot of informational things and like they do the plant swaps, but she's had a lot of people ask about having gardens installed or getting help with that. And so, and that's more what Adapt's focus is we're actually about putting the plants in the ground. And so what we've talked about doing joint efforts of maybe at least referring people to Adapt that are really interested in getting help putting in gardens. But that's about the extent so far, but I'd love to do more with them.
Okay. Crystal, you are next in the list here.
Hi, yes, this was really great. I have a septic tank in my backyard, and as much as I want to plant a bunch of deep-rooted plants over that, I obviously cannot. Do you guys have any suggestions for septic tanks?
It's a great question. I haven't come up against that particular issue before. Is your yard smaller or bigger? I don't know what the range
No,
of like the
it's
septic.
fairly big, and it is fairly big, and I've started doing stuff around it, but I would like to one day not have grass so I don't have to like worry about cutting it anymore. But and I've looked up a bunch of resources online as well, and they said you shouldn't even like mulch over it, so that isn't an option. Yeah, so I don't
Interesting.
really know what to do about it. Yeah.
Do you know anything about like the depth of the tank? And like, so I'm thinking if there are shallower root native plants, because some
Yeah, it's
are around 6 feet, but some are shallower. Mhm.
yeah, it's probably like less than a foot under the ground is what you have to like avoid. Like a foot is the max probably. So yeah.
Sure. It's something I'm definitely going to read more about. And I'd love to get your info. Maybe we can chat more about it. I'm picturing just like your yard full of native plants and then this little strip, like little circle of turf grass where you have like your like patio table and like you invite people over for tea and things in your little.
It's not a small area. It's not the septic tank that's so much the problem as the drainage field. And the
Yeah,
drainage
it's the
field is the
drainage.
larger area.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see.
It's like I have the measurements somewhere. I had to have someone come out and measure it before I started doing stuff around it. But yeah, it's like 10 feet by like, I don't know, 40 or something. It's probably less than that. But
It's substantial.
yeah, 10
Okay.
by
Yeah.
30. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
My-
Anyways,
yeah.
you
My
all
impulse-
maybe want to look into. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, my impulse would be maybe like sedges or clover or something really really low lying and like a cover plant that isn't gonna grow really deep roots. But if you want to give me your email address or something, I'd love to look
Yeah.
into it. Yeah, and get back to you.
I will put that in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
That was a good question. Mark?
Thank you, Kayla, for a wonderful presentation, and you had lots and lots of resources for us. I'm going to mention two books I've used. One of them is Landscaping with Native Plants of Michigan by Lynn Steiner, and it has a very nice list of different species that you can use. And then I have put both of these into the chat, so you can look at them there. This one is Using Native Plants to Restore Community, Nancy Small and Tom Small. Tom is right here and is the next in line to make a comment or question. So I wonder if he would tell us if this book is a really wonderful book that goes beyond just the native plants themselves, but to some broader questions, which I found very helpful. And I'd like to ask him if that's still available. Thanks.
And that puts you up, Tom.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Kayla, for a very fine program. And welcome to the native plant community and natural landscaping. And we wish you the best. And I'd be happy to meet you and talk with you at any time. And take advantage, please, of our programs at Portage District Library. I know you've been talking with Quinn and Mike and a lot of our good people. So that's wonderful. Yes, The book is available. It's in its 5th printing. It's available at local bookstores. And it does have lots of plant lists and of various kinds and a lot of background information. And I want also to call your attention to the websites of the local chapter, Kalamazoo Area Wildones.org and the national organization wildones.org, both of which have a lot of information, resources, including a whole series of garden designs and suggestions for plant communities and how to go about it. As Mark and Kayla suggest, I think the way in which ADAPT can particularly be very helpful to you is in really helping with the actual installation. Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones does installations, but they're mostly on public lands and businesses, those kinds of places. Our person power resources are limited. So we're welcoming to the community another group that can really help you get started and actually do some of the hands-on work for you. We can provide seeds, we can provide information, we can provide all kinds of help, training, workshops on seed propagation, seed gathering, all those kinds of things. But we don't do a lot of work. We do site visits and assessments of what can be done, but ADAPT can actually even help you with the installation and with some of the plants themselves. We do have 2 plant exchanges a year. We have one, well, the next one coming up would be next June, the 2nd, at our house, 2502 White Avenue. And no money changes hands, just plants. So there's another resource. And thank you again, Kayla. And we look forward to working with you and cooperating with you. And we look forward to helping as many people as possible join the native plant revolution for the sake of climate change and the restoration of community. Thanks.
So it sounds like we have now 2 compatible organizations in town. That's very good. Tyler.
Hello. I just want to say thank you very much, Kayla. It was a wonderful presentation. I am here representing the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. We have our rain garden program out front, and I am the main educator for that. I do have an upper, but I'm typically the one who gives the tours to our patrons. So I love to give out resources as much as I can. One of the most amazing ones that I heard you mention during this was the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, which I'd really like to have that link. But I can totally email you and I can just grab a couple of those resources. But I did also very much appreciate those books you offered, Mark. So I just want to make sure that I can grab as many resources as I can for the patrons that come in. I just like to give that to those people. So any resources is much appreciated, but thank you very, very much, Kayla.
You're welcome.
I'm all in favor of electric lawnmowers, but please remember that under current circumstances, unless you have your own solar panels or wind turbines, most of the energy that's charging your battery is coming from coal-fired electricity. Therefore, please support the Michigan Clean Energy Futures package currently under consideration in the Michigan State Legislature. Thanks.
Okay, any other questions from? Okay, I have 2 different questions. One is you mentioned the dams having a problem with water saturation. So we're talking earthen dams there. We're not talking the cement ones, right?
So it's actually, it's not the dam itself, it's the soil surrounding it. It
Okay.
becomes, yeah, saturated and loses its integrity. Yeah, and it compromises then the integrity of the dam, which is counting on this soil stability.
So it affects all dams, not just earthen dams then?
I think so. I read about it a little bit. It's not my area of expertise,
Okay,
but
yeah.
from what I read, it's they're dams that were built around a certain period, a certain design or architecture that they later kind of revised to take care of that problem. So it's older dams.
Okay,
And I don't know exactly what era they were built in, but
okay.
not all dams. I guess some take that into account now, but mhm.
And then this is a question that I've had for years. I've asked Tom this in the past also. With climate change and with bird migration changing, with insect migration changing, our native plants are not necessarily meeting the purpose of native plants did 50 years ago. And so my question really is, are we beginning to adapt what we think of as native plants to coincide with the changes that are occurring around us? The Nature Center, when they were planting some trees this last spring and summer, they actually imported from Indiana so that they were bringing in the same species, but a southern version of the species that was more acclimatized to the heat. And I see Tom has his hand up probably to answer this also. So that was my question is, what are we doing to adapt what native plants are? And you want me to open it up for Tom to answer, or do you want to answer?
No, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so both of you can take this one. Tom, you want to go first? You're muted, Tom.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Kayla. I'll follow.
Sure. Yeah, so I actually did, when I was doing research for this presentation, I came across quite a few resources that were talking about just that and how climate forward landscaping, we're going to have to start shifting what species we're using. And there are some really interesting, I didn't link any of these in the resources, but I could definitely find them again. There were some really interesting maps that were showing kind of the climatic shifts and then, you know, correlative plants that would potentially do better in, you know, 100, 200 years.
Well, it's not that far in advance that I want to plant for, but rather than spend a lot of money on a plant that's going to no longer be viable in 10 years or 20 years, 10 years, let's say. Yeah, I did. Yeah. Okay, Tom?
Yes, thank you. I can provide also lists if you're interested. And there are some lists that I've provided for the city of Kalamazoo, particularly in the matter of trees. And I believe those lists are still available through the city's website for the natural features inventory website overlay, natural feature protection overlay. So yeah, we can't afford to be purists any longer, even about some non-native species that are adaptable. And so I'm going to recommend another book, The Living Landscape by Doug Tallamy and Rick Dark, which has a lot of information about functional problems and concerns, and the importance of function rather than purity of genotype. And if you go to the planetary boundaries site of the Stockholm Resilience Institute, you'll find a diagram of where we are beyond planetary boundaries. And one of them is way beyond the limit, the safe limit for humanity and the rest of the creation. And that's functional biodiversity, not genetic biodiversity, which is way beyond the boundary. Functional biodiversity is even farther.
Right.
So function is extremely important. What's going to function within your environment? And research is underway. There's a lot out there. Kayla can help you. We can help you with Wild Ones if you really want more information about how to adapt to what's happening. Because our notions of nature are changing, our notions of landscape are changing, and that's the focus of my program for Wild Ones on the 25th of October, 7 p.m., Portage District Library. That's part of what I'm going to be talking about. So many thanks for the question.
Are there any final questions or comments apart from saying thank you, Kayla, for a very informative, and I generated a lot of comments and questions. You know, that's always good. Tim, you just raised your hand.
Yes, it's with very, very mixed feelings that I follow up on Tom's comment about planetary boundaries. This is the diagram that he was referring to, which I see is out of focus.
Right.
However, and I hate to say this, but it's reality. We have globally exceeded 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, only one of which is climate change. So I can only beg all of you with the highest possible urgency, please help us address these problems.
Any other comments before we call it a day?